At a weekly Bible study, the group leader asked an elderly man, Walt, to open the meeting with prayer. Well, he did so in a soft voice, and then another man, straining to hear, shouted, "I can't hear you." Walt replied, "I wasn't talking to you." Which is true. Well, once again, brothers and sisters, we gather to celebrate the feast of St. Francis. He's a man who wasn't quiet. He wasn't like Walt, but he spoke loudly to the whole world of his love for God. There's that famous quote, "Preach the gospel always, and when necessary, use words." Well, this is what St. Francis did. His life was a reflection of the gospel, and he wanted the world to come to know and love God through him. He didn't start like this, though. He went through a series of conversions. The first one happened after a battle with Perugia, Assisi and Perugia. And as a young man, he was into chivalry. He wanted to be the center of attention. But when Assisi lost that battle, he was imprisoned for about a year. And during that time in prison, a conversion began to happen. And when he returned home, he devoted more time to quiet prayer. Well, after this, God continued to work in his life. When Francis traveled to Rome, he exchanged his clothes with a beggar. And then when he returned to Assisi, he passed by a leper and he greeted him with a sign of peace. Before this, he didn't want to have anything to do with lepers. He was repulsed by them. But God was working on his heart, helping him to conquer himself. And then finally, we all know the story of San Damiano. The Lord spoke to Francis from the cross, telling him to rebuild my church. And Francis took that literally, to rebuild the little church that he was in. But later he realized that God wanted him to rebuild the universal church spiritually. And he did this with the Franciscan order through a life of poverty, simplicity, and surrendering to the will of God. Now, it's easy for us to look at St. Francis's life as a whole and say God was really at work in his life. We had the bigger picture. But with our own lives, we don't have that bigger picture. The story of our lives, it's still playing out. And many times when difficulties come our way, we may wonder if God's there. But our first reading, it reminds us that he always is, and that he's faithful to us and he loves us. The Israelites, they sinned and they were complaining to God. And what we see in this reading is a trial of sorts. God enters into dialogue with them. He tells them to present their plea. He says, "Present your plea before the mountains and let the hills hear your voice." And these are incredible words because the Israelites, they complain, but God's saying, look at the wonders of the Lord, everything that he created. It speaks of his greatness and his love for them. And then he goes on to question Israel, "What have I done to you? Or how have I wearied you? Answer me." Well, after this, he describes to them the things that he's done for them. He led them out of slavery in Egypt, and he gave them Moses, Miriam, and Aaron. And it's then that Israel realizes that it wasn't God who had been unfaithful to them, but they were unfaithful to God. And God really, he puts things into perspective for them. He makes them realize that there's really nothing to complain about, but everything to be thankful for. Well, in our own lives, we may make this mistake. When things stack up against us, when we're struggling with sin, or we feel the weight of the world on our shoulders, our first reaction may be to complain. But if we step back and we look at the bigger picture, if we put things into perspective, there's really nothing to complain about, but everything to be thankful for. Think about everything God's done for us. St. Paul reminds us in our second reading that he's made us a new creation. Like the Israelites who were led out of slavery in Egypt, we've been led through the waters of baptism and set free from slavery to sin and death. And this is something we should be thankful for every day. And what can help us to show a little more gratitude to God is humility, realizing who we are without God, that we're all deserving of death. But God became man, and he died for each of us. And even now, he reaches out to us through the sacraments, through our loved ones, through all of creation. All of these things are expressions of God's love for us. And the greatest way that we can show our thanks to him is to embrace the Christian life by doing right and loving goodness, by walking humbly with God, really to circumcise our hearts by seeking continuous conversion. Teresa of Avila, she once spoke about continuous conversion when she was speaking about the spiritual life in her Interior Castle book. And she used the castle to describe the different stages of the spiritual life, that there's different rooms in the castle. And she complained because she noticed that a lot of people, they never make it to the center of the castle. They go along for a while doing fine, but then they stop. They get complacent. They get comfortable where they are in life, and they don't move forward. Well, she knew that in the spiritual life, there was always room to grow. And the humble, they understand this. Their humility, it makes room for God in their lives. It empties them of worldly things so that their hearts can be filled with him. And he'll enlarge our hearts if we allow him to, like he did St. Francis, if we continue to receive his graces and respond to him. But we don't have to overcomplicate things. The Pharisees are really good at that. Jesus in our gospel, he says, his yoke is easy and his burden is light. And he says this because even though we encounter difficulties in the Christian life, which, it's guaranteed, our Lord, He's on the cross here, and he promised his disciples that this life isn't going to be easy, that we're going to have difficulties in the world. But this saying, my yoke is easy and my burden light, he's telling us that he's always there to help us. He knows that we can't live up to that call to holiness on our own. And the life of St. Francis showed us this because before his conversion, as I was telling you, he despised the lepers. There is a biography on him. I don't remember the author, but in the biography it said, so greatly loathsome was the sight of lepers to him. He used to say that in the days of his vanity, he would look at their houses only from a distance of 2 miles, and he would hold his nostrils with his hands. But by the grace of God, Francis, he began to despise himself, and he started to love the lepers and the poor more and more. And perhaps today, we don't have to go quite as far as St. Francis, but we can start by changing our mindset. Those moments that we want to complain, we can look for reasons to be thankful. It'll make us appreciate things more. And if we're constantly giving thanks to God for everything in life, then we'll begin to see the graces in everything, how he's working through it all, and we'll better respond to those graces, and our lives will change. They'll become the gospel like Francis as God works in and through us. And it'll be loud without us even having to say a word.